Heather's Hero. Chapter 1. Heather strummed her fingers on the steering wheel to Fleetwood Mac's The Chain. Outside, pink flowers from Japanese cherry trees danced on a crisp Tennessee spring breeze. A few more blocks and she'd reach the retirement home and begin a fun afternoon of repotting plants with the residents. A car plowed through the intersection, ran a red light, and crashed into Heather's Honda Accord. Her body tensed on impact, but she had no time to avoid the collision. The sickening sound of crunching metal and shattering glass was followed by the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber. When Heather opened her eyes, the world around her took a moment to stop moving. She loosened her white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel and blinked at the deployed side-impact airbag. Through the shattered windshield, she saw Blake climb out of his car and approach her. Black pants, black shirt. The image of him was blurred by smoke puffing out from under her hood and something warm running into her left eye. Dread and fear pulsed through her as she stared at those familiar, ice-cold eyes. She needed to get out of her car and away from him, but she was frozen in terror. "Hey man, you okay?" A bystander approached Blake. As a crowd of bystanders began to gather, Heather's attacker abruptly turned and stalked away from the scene of his crime. "You need to get out of the car right now." Heather jolted when she saw a man sitting beside her in the passenger seat. She'd been driving alone, hadn't she? He was in his early 30s, with dark hair and sharp, defined facial features, chiseled jaw and ruddy cheekbones. His brown hair and thick eyebrows accentuated a pair of warm, brown eyes. "What?" "You're leaking oil," he said. "When that ignites and combines with the fertilizer in your back seat, your whole car will go up in flames." She noticed his clothing. A well-worn, fire-retardant black uniform with yellow reflective stripes. Firefighter. How had he gotten here so fast after the crash? And how had he managed to get inside the car? His sleeve had a circular patch with a raven against a blue sky sewn into it. The heat in the car intensified. "Move it, Phillips!" The fireman barked at her. She fumbled free from her seatbelt before shoving open the driver's side door and clambering out, dragging her purse with her. With the movement, she felt pain for the first time since the collision. Her left shoulder throbbed in rhythm with her head. She stumbled to a nearby sidewalk on the corner of Crossland Avenue and Cumberland Drive. As she looked around, she didn't see the firefighter. She didn't see Blake either. Her car burst into flame, and she gaped at the sudden heat and fire. 10 seconds earlier, and she'd have been toast. Where had the man who'd saved her gone? He'd mysteriously vanished. Suddenly nauseated, she sat on the cold concrete and put her head between her knees. "Are you okay, young lady? Your head's bleeding. I called an ambulance." She looked up to see a man in his 60s standing over her with a worried expression. A friendly Good Samaritan, she deduced immediately. She looked down at her baby blue turtleneck, stained with drops of blood from her head wound. "I'm okay." She'd had worse. Blake had done worse, and he'd probably be back to finish what he'd started. Heather looked around again. "Where's the fire department?" She didn't see the fireman's truck or hear sirens. "They should be here soon. The Clarksville Fire Rescue Station is just a few blocks away from here. I've got a first aid kit in my car, if you want me to clean that up a bit." "No, thanks. I need to make some phone calls." She pulled her phone out of her purse and called her friend Evelyn. By late afternoon, Heather had arrived home to the cheerful yips of Denver. The large German shepherd greeted her at the door as his ferocious tail wagged the entire back half of his furry body. She dropped her purse on the entry table and deactivated and reset the alarm before sinking her fingers into soft fur. Lowering herself to the floor, she let the dog smother her with love. After the accident, crash, there had been nothing accidental about Blake careening into her car. Heather had watched the fire department drown her car, answered police questions, and turned down an ambulance trip to the ER. She didn't need another trauma evaluation. One more CT scan of her head in her lifetime, and she'd start glowing in the dark. Besides, she'd been beaten and bruised enough to know when she needed to take a few ibuprofen and sleep it off. She hadn't lost consciousness after the crash, which was reassuring. Though maybe she had hallucinated. She'd seen a man in her car when he couldn't have gotten in through the smashed passenger side door or through the broken windshield. She'd seen the firefighter even though the fire truck hadn't arrived on the scene yet. "Well, boy," she scratched behind Denver's ears, "if I'm going to hallucinate a fireman who saves my life, he might as well be drop-dead gorgeous."
"Thanks."
Heather startled. She looked up to see the same man standing in her living room, with his arms crossed. She shot to her feet. "How'd you get in here?" Denver cocked his head to one side, looking at her while not seeming to notice the uninvited guest. Normally, her guard dog was very protective.
"I'm not sure exactly."
The man wore a slightly bemused expression and the same black gear as in her car. His black and yellow uniform was different than the grayish-brown gear she'd seen on the Clarksville firefighters. She backed away and pressed herself against the front door. "I don't know whether to scream or thank you."
"I don't require gratitude for doing my job, and I'd prefer you not scream."
Something about his appearance seemed odd. She stared harder at him and realized she could see her television on the opposite wall through him. She walked closer, inspecting him. Denver followed her before walking right through the man to go lay on his rug in the living room. Heather shrieked, recoiled back, bumped the table beside the couch, and barely caught her lamp before it fell over.
"Nice catch."
After setting the lamp upright, she backed away toward the kitchen, stammering. "You're a ghost."
"Seems that way."
He frowned. Did he not know he was a ghost? And since when were ghosts real? "I must have hit my head really hard." She snatched a glass from her cupboard and poured herself orange juice from the refrigerator. She glanced at Denver again, who made no response to the sound of a deep male voice in his house. The fireman looked down at his appearance.
"I could be a figment of your imagination, but I feel like I'm my own person, in a manner of speaking."
Heather drank the juice, the cold hitting her empty stomach with a revitalizing burst. "Do you have a name?"
I don't know."
His expression changed from confused to deeply sad. She decidedly didn't like seeing him sad. She preferred playful and bemused over sad. "What does the raven symbolize?" she asked. He looked at the patch sewn onto his uniform.
"Reckoning, rebirth, protection, guidance. They mean different things to different religions. Sometimes different things in the same religion."
"Okay. Let's call you Rave." He grinned, his warm eyes radiating amicably.
"I like that."
She pulled a container of ramen noodles from her pantry, peeled the lid back, and added water. She hadn't eaten all day. Maybe some food would put an end to her overactive imagination. "So, you make a habit of saving women in car crashes?" She eyed him nervously.
"I've rescued a few, though I think I was still living at the time. It's all a little fuzzy."
"Yeah? I can relate." She pointed to the bandage on her forehead. She punched the microwave buttons and hit start.
"Are you okay?"
Rave asked. "Since I'm talking to a fireman's ghost, probably not. But since you're the best-looking thing in my disastrous life right now, and you saved my life, I'm just going to roll with it. I'm not going to look a gift ghost in the mouth."
"Disastrous,"
he said, cutting through her attempt to lighten the mood. "How much of the crash did you see?"
Just you in the car, the smoke and the fertilizer.
And my name. You called me Phillips.
Heather Phillips. I don't know why I know your name and not my own.
She'd never met Rave. She would have remembered that face and those caring eyes. She'd also never hit her head so hard that she saw a man in her house. Why a fireman? She didn't have a fetish she was aware of. Though, if Rave stuck around, she might develop one. Except, she'd sworn off men after Blake.
Are you okay?
Rave asked again. Heather blinked and watched a tear fall into her noodles as she mixed them. Yeah, she sniffed. Long day.
A long day doesn't make a disastrous life.
Maybe disastrous is too strong. No, it's probably accurate. The man who rammed his car into mine and then ran off is my abusive ex. Apparently, he found me, even after I moved cross-country, stayed off social media, and dyed my brown hair red. She ate her noodles. Rave stiffened.
So, he's still out there?
Oh yeah, he's definitely still out there. Chapter 2. Rave glanced back at the dog on the rug, who watched his owner with adoring eyes. Heather said, I'm safe here. I've got an alarm system. And Denver. Rave turned back to Heather, who ate her noodles one by one, but didn't seem to enjoy them. She had vibrant, wavy, dark red hair that was obviously dyed, yet it looked good on her. It accentuated her vibrant green eyes. Her face was a lovely oval, and her lips full and symmetrical. On her forehead were 3 steri strips over a laceration on her hairline, and Rave wondered how he knew that detail. The thought of Heather being in danger flared a protective instinct in Rave, even though she was a stranger. But then, he was a firefighter and had an inclination toward protecting everyone. Except he couldn't do any of that as a ghost. No extinguishing fires, no administering first aid, no rescuing cats from trees. Well, the latter of those he was certain he'd never done.
Why is he after you?
Rave asked. Blake? She rolled her shoulders, and Rave instantly knew she had a large bruise on her left shoulder, even though he couldn't see it. I got away. I damaged his ego. He told me that if I ever left, he'd kill me. I believe he intends to follow through on that. Rave pursed his lips. Heather may have been talking calmly about the threat on her life, but a small tremor in her hand betrayed her fear. He looked around her kitchen and living room. It was an efficient house, but not warm and cozy. The walls had no photos. The absence of decorations created a lack of personal touch. She may have started her life over after escaping Blake, but she must have suspected he'd find her. She hadn't established a home, just a temporary place to live.
What if...
Rave began. What about your life? Heather cut in. She went back to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of Zinfandel.
My life?
He remembered pieces, like growing up in a happy home, photos and trophies on every wall and mantel. His parents had pictures of him from birth to college graduation. When he didn't answer, Heather continued. If you're not a figment of my imagination, tell me about you. She poured the wine into a glass and took a sip.
I remember going into a building fire, fully involved. He shook his head. I worked as a fireman while I finished my bachelor's degree. Then I got my certificate as a fire investigator. I'm climbing the ranks to arson investigator. I'm still a firefighter while waiting for the right job to become available. Something close to home.
He scrubbed a hand over his face before continuing.
I don't even know where home is anymore. And I can't smell right now. I remember the smell of smoke. Different scents based on what's on fire. Wood fires are musky and pleasing. Plastic and rubbers are abrasive and acrid. Burning flesh is like tanned leather over a charcoal flame.
He hesitated at her stunned expression.
Sorry, that last one was too descriptive.
It's okay, she said slowly, moving the bowl of half-eaten noodles to the sink. I doubt I could have conjured those descriptions from my subconscious, which makes a stronger case for you being a real ghost, whatever that is, rather than a figment of my imagination. So, are you on your way to a fire now? He looked down at his gear.
Guess I'm overdressed. I wonder...
As his voice trailed off, he imagined himself wearing normal firehouse attire. As he did so, his fire gear disappeared to reveal his uniform slacks and a white undershirt. Heather choked on her wine as she gave a nervous chuckle. Okay, maybe you should cover that back up.
I'm covered. What are you talking about?
She cleared her throat. This part must be my mind conjuring images. Your white shirt leaves nothing to the imagination. Oh! She hopped up from the chair and walked to him. There's another raven. He watched her inspecting the black tattoo on his bicep. He remembered going to the tattoo parlor with friends, fellow firefighters. After tattoos, they'd gone out for beers to celebrate. Hops, greasy fries, Aerosmith playing on the jukebox. What were they celebrating? Rave couldn't remember. Heather was close, but not touching him. Not that she could. It's very intricate. I don't remember ever having a thing for birds. I don't think this part is coming from my imagination either. When she straightened and looked into his eyes, she was only inches from his face. He suddenly felt like a fully involved house fire had engulfed him. Who was this woman, and why could only she see him? He took a step back from her.
I'm not a figment of your imagination.
Her lips curled in a luscious half-smile. I agree. What woman invents an attractive man who doesn't want her in his personal space? Rave swallowed, but didn't know how to respond. Denver barked once and got to his feet. A second later, the doorbell rang. The canine stuck his nose at the seam and sniffed, tail wagging. Relax, Rave. My friend Evelyn is here. She's staying with me tonight in case my head bump turns into a massive head bleed and I need to be rushed to the hospital. Okay, I was being melodramatic. Don't look so worried. Heather deactivated the alarm and let her friend inside the house. Evelyn handed her a container of homemade cupcakes. I brought us some comfort food. Edgar has the kids, so I can stay all night. Thank you for the cupcakes. Heather set them on the kitchen counter. And thank you for feeding and walking Denver earlier today. Any time. Who were you talking to? Heather shot Rave a look. Myself, mostly, I think. She waved a hand in the air. I'm probably delirious.
Who wouldn't be after what you've been through?
Evelyn tossed her jacket on the back of Heather's sofa. She patted Denver's head as she walked through Rave on her way to the kitchen. She was a good foot shorter than Heather and had straight blonde hair. Her skirt suggested some type of professional office or executive work. And since when do cars erupt in flames? I thought that only happened in movies. I was carrying fertilizer to Sunnydale. The nursing home you visit? Retirement home. I was going to repot plants with some of the residents this weekend. Oh, Zinfandel. Evelyn poured herself a glass. I really appreciate you coming, Heather added. The blonde woman waved a hand of dismissal as she sipped her beverage. Of course, but you can't drink alcohol after bumping your head. She shook a finger at Heather's glass. You know, when we first compared exes, I thought you had Nightmare of the Year award. But this is a full-on Nightmare of the Decade. And he got away with it? What are you going to do? Heather dumped the rest of her beverage down the sink. The easy familiarity of the two women had Rave suspecting they'd been close friends for a while. Heather fixed herself a glass of water. I don't know what to do. She arranged a bag of ice and slipped it under her shirt, against her left shoulder. The women took their drinks and sat on opposite ends of the couch, looking at each other. They launched into conversation about Evelyn's work in real estate, and Heather's car turned fireball turned junkyard trash. Rave partly listened and partly dwelled in his own thoughts. Was Heather's danger the reason for his presence? Was he supposed to protect her somehow? He had no physical body to do much of anything. But he could watch out for danger. He'd known and warned her about the car fire. For now, Heather didn't need him hovering while she enjoyed time with a friend. He concentrated on just fading from view, and slowly the room around him began to dissolve into darkness. Just before he vanished completely, Rave caught a concerned and sad look from Heather. Chapter 3. Heather woke to the smell of her automatic coffee maker. Best purchase ever. She stretched and padded out of the room, Denver by her side. She read the note on the counter. Headed to work early. Pretty sure snoring and drooling are normal for you, so I thought it was medically safe for me to leave. If I'm wrong and you're lying on the floor with internal bleeding, please call me. Better yet, text me when you're awake. Evelyn. Heather rolled her eyes and balled up the note. After pouring a cup of coffee, she texted Evelyn that she was awake. She flicked the note off the counter and into the trash. Retrieving half and half from her refrigerator, she added it to her coffee.
You like a little coffee with your cream?
Bah! She jerked, spilling cream on her hand and shirt.
Sorry.
Heather glowered at Rave as she snatched a towel and cleaned the mess. The fireman still wore navy slacks and a fitted white shirt over bulging biceps. He was also still semi-transparent. You're back. Okay. It was entertaining at first, but now I'm getting a little spooked.
No pun intended?
He arched an eyebrow. Funny. Have you been here all night?
Well, it turns out I don't need sleep, so I watched your perimeter.
You were guarding me?
Yes, and did you know your neighbor smokes cigarettes with oxygen in the home? It's a fire risk.
Janet? Yeah, she smokes. I think she's trying to quit. Heather took several sips of coffee, not knowing what to tell Rave. She wasn't going to nag or police her neighbors because the ghost of a firefighter suggested it. Firefighter. She felt the caffeine already kicking in. Or maybe her brain was just trained to wake at the taste of coffee. Maybe you died on duty, and that's why you showed up in uniform. He scowled slightly.
Is that relevant?
Well, yeah. Shouldn't we figure out who you were?
Why?
I read this article once. Probably hogwash, but it was an interview with a psychic detective from Georgia. I seem to remember him saying that ghosts linger when they need help moving on.
You want me to leave?
Okay, don't make me out to be callous. I can't handle a ghost in my life, real or imaginary. Why don't I help you find whatever closure you need?
What if my closure is helping you survive Blake?
How is that logical, if you and I never met before you died? He placed his hands on his hips.
Did you get that from the Medium article, too?
Don't you want to know if you left behind loved ones?
Don't you want to not become a ghost like me?
Rave shot back. Heather laughed. You realize we're arguing about who should help whom? Rave blew out a breath without moving any actual air.
Right. Let's compromise. We'll find out who I was while we figure out a way to stop Blake.
You escalated from watching out for me to stopping Blake.
Stopping Blake is watching out for you,
he countered. Watching out for me is defensive. I intend to plan where to move next. Stopping Blake is offensive.
Then I want an offensive strategy.
He crossed his arms. Handsome though he was, and adoringly consumed with her safety, she wasn't following anyone's orders. I'm going to have to hear this strategy before I agree. Meanwhile, I'll investigate you online. She brought her cup of coffee over to the kitchen table, where she opened her laptop. Rave stood beside her, watching. She searched for firefighters killed in the line of duty. I don't suppose you could narrow this down by remembering your name? Maybe you at least know what part of the country you lived in?
NFD.
Beg pardon?
Nashville Fire Department.
Ah, so you're close to here then. She typed in her search on the keyboard. Okay, here's something. They read the headline together. November 12. One firefighter was killed and 2 injured in a building fire Friday night. Fire investigators suspect the fire may have been the product of arson. Heather turned and looked up at Rave. He was leaning close, reading the screen with a dazed look in those brown eyes. Now who's invading whose personal space? But she wasn't going to point that out, because she liked his proximity. Ring any bells?
Yes.
His Adam's apple bobbed in a swallow. The light above the kitchen table dimmed, and her laptop screen flickered. Hey, what are you doing? She asked. He leaned back and looked around. The light and computer returned to normal.
I don't know. Sorry.
You just keep your supernatural powers bottled up on the inside. No frying my laptop. I need it to make a living. She clicked on the link provided in the article to another article. Officer Victor Roberts died in the line of duty November 11th. He is survived by 3 siblings. A memorial service will be held on November 15th. The burial will take place at Grove Cemetery. Victor, is that you?
I guess so. This is the only Tennessee fireman death. I definitely recognize that building. I remember going into that building.
Okay. Victor. She tapped a finger to her lips. Nope, I'm going to leave you at Rave. It can be your ghost nickname. He nodded, but his expression looked doleful. How about we visit your grave? She said softly. Maybe it will trigger some memories or help with closure. The fire was only 5 days ago. She wished she could offer the platonic comfort of holding his hand. How awful it must be to learn about your own death.
No. We agreed to find my identity, and now that's done. Now we focus on your safety.
She stood and spoke in a comforting tone. I think this is what you need. I'm no ghost expert. You're my first. Ugh, that sounded wrong. Anyway, I'm a counselor. People need closure. Maybe ghosts do too.
I'm fine. Dead as of 5 days ago, but fine.
The kitchen light flickered again. Heather looked skeptically up at the ceiling lights. Uh-huh. Rave was definitely not fine. With determination, she went to her room, dressed, and emerged with phone in hand. She pulled on a light jacket and tossed a golden scarf around her neck.
Where are you going?
Rave asked with alarm. I'm going to visit Victor Roberts' grave. You're welcome to join me. Since he considered himself part of her protection duty, she suspected he would. He narrowed his eyes at her and stepped closer, towering over her by a half-foot.
I know what you're doing.
I hope so. I'm being fairly transparent. Pun intended. She walked around him, let Denver out to the backyard, and then came to her front door. Rave stood with his arms crossed, a pose he seemed to favor.
It isn't safe.
I'm not keeping myself on house arrest. If you're worried about my safety, come with me. She reached for the door.
Heather.
The worry in his voice made her stop and stare up at him. When was the last time a man had spoken her name with such husky concern? Never. Real ghost or not, he wasn't here to stay. She wouldn't let herself get too attached. A horn honked, shattering the looming silence between them. My rideshare. She extended a hand through him, opened the door, and left. Rave stood inside Heather's house, cursing her stubbornness. They hadn't yet formulated a plan on stopping Blake. but she was throwing caution to the wind and dashing into the open. Admittedly, Rave was being irrationally reluctant to learn about the life he'd lost. What if it hadn't been a good life? How could it have been good if he didn't remember it? How could he not remember having siblings? What if the road to truth was paved with disappointment? But he couldn't leave Heather alone. He vanished from her house and appeared in the rideshare beside her. How was he able to sense where she was and simply will himself to her? Keeping his spirit in pace with the car took some effort and concentration as he kept fading in and out. But he managed. On the 40-minute ride to a cemetery outside Nashville, he watched the buildings and trees as they passed. Early spring in Tennessee was always beautiful. Yellow forsythias were in bloom alongside white magnolias. Redbuds had shed their pink flowers, leaving their heart-shaped leaves visible. When Heather exited the rideshare, Rave followed. She waited outside the cemetery as the car and driver left. "Thank you for coming," she said to him. "I do feel safer with you close by." Rave extended his senses as far out from Heather as he could. No danger, no stalker, no Blake.
"Shall we?"
he asked. Heather nodded and led the way between the crypts and gravestones. The morning sky was gray and overcast. Ravens perched in looming trees, watching the two of them walk past rows of tombstones. A breeze stirred fallen white petals shed by pear trees.
"You said you used to be a counselor?"
Rave asked. "Yes, student counselor. When I left Blake, I left that life behind. That was 5 years ago. To maintain anonymity, I write a column under a pseudonym."
"A column?"
"Sort of a Dear Abby, but for parents, to ask about school-aged kids."
"That's creative. I love going to schools and talking about fire safety with children. They take in everything, with their minds as open as their wide eyes. Or, I did like schools."
He shoved his hands into the pockets of his navy slacks. "If it's any consolation, I miss interacting with kids, too." Heather stopped and turned toward Rave.
"You're a good person, Heather."
He stroked a hand lightly over her hair, unable to feel its texture. Then his eyes fell on the steri strips over the cut on her forehead. How could anyone harm this woman?
"Let's get to the grave."
He forced the words out. Regardless of what his life had been, he could do this one last thing as a ghost. Stay with Heather until she was definitely safe. They continued to wander until they found Victor's grave. Rave stood and stared at the headstone. The ravens, which had been dispersed throughout the cemetery, congregated on the trees and stones near the fallen fireman's grave. "That's a lot of birds." Heather glanced around nervously.
"Don't fear them. I don't know why they're here, but they're not dangerous."
She poked a finger toward his tattoo with a wry grin. "I think I know why they're here. They're connected to you."
"Are they?"
Her theory sounded plausible. Rave raised his hands and spun in a slow circle. Dozens of ravens took flight and swirled around them like a black, silky whirlwind. Heather gasped and smiled. "Are you doing this?"
"I think I am."
He felt a faint connection to them, like the strings extending to puppets, though the birds' actions felt more like they were answering a request than obeying a command. He smiled back at Heather before having the birds descend and fly around the two of them. They stirred the air and whipped Heather's red hair around her head. With flushed cheeks, she raised her arms in awe and looked transcendent with glowing red hair in a backdrop of black wings and white flowers stirred into the air by their flapping.
"Keep your arms out,"
Rave told her. She held them as ravens landed on her sleeves. She laughed. "Rave, this is amazing." He laughed, too, as the birds flapped their wings to steady themselves. The remaining birds continued to circle above in something like a dance. With a thought, Rave asked the ravens to fly away, and they did. He turned back to the grave. His heart sank as he read the words and stared at the freshly laid grass.
Heather?
Yes?
That's not me.
It's not?
Victor was one of my friends and fellow firefighters.
You remember. That's good. Then she frowned. Oh, no. I'm sorry about your friend.
Rave nodded grimly.
So, who are you? Heather asked. He gave her a lopsided grin.
I'm Rave.
She rolled her eyes playfully.
Okay. We read that one person died and others were injured. And I remember going into that building fire. So, who were the injured firemen?
The article didn't list them. We can dig further online. Or, she tapped a finger to her lips, if you can't remember your friend, can you remember what fire station you worked at?
Rave brightened. I do. I'll tell you how to get there.
Blake watched the news for the next 24 hours, on the lookout for himself. People were so quick to video with their phones that he could have been captured on the scene of the crash he'd caused. Ramming into Heather's car hadn't been part of the plan. He'd been watching her every move for a week, calculating when he could grab her. She had a lesson to learn. A lesson about faithfulness and obedience. He was planning her abduction, followed by a slow, probably painful, indoctrination into how a wife should behave. Love, honor, and obey. He'd even rented a remote house for it. But he had to carefully sculpt a plan. He couldn't grab her at her house, since she had a security system and an enormous guard dog. Somewhere in her routine of grocery shopping, errands, and lunch with her friend, he knew he'd find a weakness. But red rage had foiled his meticulous planning. First, his eye began twitching, followed by his hands wringing the steering wheel. Before he realized what he was doing, he'd gunned through the light and plowed into her vehicle. There was a certain satisfaction in seeing her dazed and bleeding. She lived, which was good, because she didn't deserve a quick death. Still seething and crackling with anger, he'd planned right then to kill her and be done with it. He would drag her out of the smoking vehicle and beat her to death. She deserved at least that much. But it was too public. People were gathering around the crash site. He'd been forced to flee. At least, no one caught him on camera, based on the news footage he'd watched. Now, Heather knew he'd found her. That part of the surprise was ruined. No matter. He'd still find a kink in her armor. A moment when her guard was down, and he could teach her those lessons. Chapter 4. Heather stepped out of her next rideshare at Rave's fire station. The 2-story brick building stood on an acre of manicured land. Out front, the American flag waved in the spring breeze. She hesitated a moment and stared.
Are you okay?
Rave asked. Yes. I was realizing that I'm traveling around town, helping a ghost solve his mystery. This is all more than a little surreal.
We can stop if you're uncomfortable.
No. I want to solve the mystery of my ghost hero's body-spirit dissociation. She marched inside the firehouse. A young, muscular black woman met her just inside the door.
Afternoon, ma'am. Can I help you?
Heather hadn't considered what she might say when she arrived. I heard about the tragic building fire.
Yes, ma'am. We flew the flag at half-staff for that. We just raised it back today.
The firewoman wore navy slacks, like Rave, and a navy t-shirt with NFD on it. I'm sorry to hear about the loss. Can I make a donation?
That's not necessary,
Rave told her, but she ignored him.
Absolutely, said the woman. Here's a brochure with the links and how to donate. We take checks, too.
Heather took out her phone and lined up the Q code. It took her to the website, and she made her donation. The woman beamed at her.
Thanks for that. I'm Joanna Smoot. Rookie of the Year,
Rave added with a grin.
She's a heck of a firefighter. Can I show you around the station?
Joanna offered. I'm Heather. I'd like that. She walked over to one wall where a photograph of men and women in dress blues hung.
These are photos of the team,
Joanna said. Heather's eyes roamed the faces in the picture. Rave pressed in close, looking with her. That one. She pointed at Rave.
Oh, that's Logan Roundhouse.
Joanna stuck her hands in her pockets.
If you were reading about the fire, you might have heard about Logan. He was injured. Chief's been checking on him every day. Says he's stable.
Stable? Heather inspected other photographs on the wall.
Yeah, a falling beam in the fire knocked him down. He's been at Vanderbilt ever since. He's in the ICU.
Joanna added the last few words in a soft voice.
Alive?
Rave was alive at a hospital. Heather saw a framed clipping of a newspaper article and a photo of Rave, Logan, and other firefighters at a local elementary school. Another photo showed Rave standing beside a bald man, bigger and bulkier than him. Rave shifted beside her.
That was Victor, except we all called him Buster.
A caption under the photo read, Victor Buster Roberts and Logan the Raven Roundhouse. The Raven. Heather stared at Logan's brown hair and brown eyes in the photo. The photo hadn't captured the depth of those compassionate eyes.
We all get nicknames around here,
Joanna said.
Heather swallowed.
Is he married?
Nah, I don't think he was even dating at the time. He worked a lot.
Rave said,
I was paying off student loans, working my way toward arson investigator. I dated someone, but I didn't want anything serious until I could support a family as an investigator, and not the crazy shift work of a fireman.
Joanna continued,
Nicest guy, though. Give you his kidney if you needed it.
That one there, she pointed to another picture,
is Logan and the chief.
Heather turned to the woman. Thanks for your time. I'm heading out now.
Thanks for the donation. But are you sure you don't want to see the fire trucks? Everyone comes to see the fire trucks.
No thanks. Maybe next time. Heather's phone chimed with a text message. She left the building and read her message. Next, she used her phone app to request another rideshare.
Where are you going?
First, I need to have lunch with Evelyn. We already arranged this a week ago. After that, we're going back to Nashville, to the hospital. We need to put your spirit and body back together again. Do you need help going to pick out a new car? Heather tugged at strands of bright auburn hair. There's no point getting a new car until I go where I need to go. So, you're moving on? Evelyn asked. He found me. I don't know how. I thought I was careful, but there are always electronic records. It took him 5 years. But he found me. Maybe I can buy myself another 5 years. It seems like the justice system ought to protect you better. Slices of uneaten pizza squatted on their table in Capriggio's pizza parlor in Clarksville. The food smelled delicious, but Heather's mind was busy racing from Rave to Blake to how to move again. It's my word against Blake's, and I don't have any proof. They're going to look for the car that hit me. And if they found him, he could be charged with a hit and run. But Blake's smart enough not to go driving around in a car registered in his name. Where will you go? Evelyn asked, dipping her straw up and down in her ice water as she drowned a wedge of lemon. I'm not sure yet, but when I do know, I'm not going to share that with anyone. So, goodbye is goodbye forever? It has to be. I'm sorry. Goodbye is permanent. Heather could call and text Evelyn from a new number, but their relationship wouldn't be the same. I really enjoyed our friendship. You took me out of the dark place I was in when I first had to start all over. I hope you know you're my hero. Evelyn snorted. Just a friend,
Not a hero. As far as I can tell, you're the hero of your own story. You managed to extricate yourself from a dangerous situation when you left Blake. Then, after suffering a head injury, you had enough wits about you to get away from your car when it was on fire. Heather picked at a piece of pepperoni on top of her pizza. Still, the last 5 years would have been a lot harder without a friend like you. I'll help you pack. If anything changes, or if you need help, you know where to find me and how to reach me. I do, thank you. I also have a favor to ask of you. Can you give Denver and me a lift to Vanderbilt University Medical Center? Sure. Is tomorrow morning okay? I have the kids this afternoon. Is somebody sick? I don't know. I'm going to check on a friend. Tomorrow works great. Thanks. Heather took a bite of pizza. Evelyn sat up straighter and picked up a slice of pizza. Okay. Now that the serious stuff is out of the way, we need to talk about the latest gossip with Prince William and Princess Kate. Heather smiled. She wasn't particularly emotionally invested in the royal family, but she enjoyed Evelyn's enthusiasm, and the conversation would be a welcome reprieve from her nagging worry about starting a new life. We definitely need to talk about that. Rave followed Heather inside her house after the two women finished lunch and Evelyn drove Heather home. Sorry about lunch. There wasn't really a way to include you in the conversation. She gave Denver a robust greeting in the form of behind-the-ear scratches. It's okay. I've never been a fly on the wall at a ladies' luncheon. It's a new experience for me. Heather poured a glass of wine. Wine in the afternoon? Rave teased. Yes, we're celebrating. You're alive. This is great news. She took a sip of wine before retrieving cardboard boxes from her hall closet. She placed one on her counter beside a stack of newspapers. So, Logan Roundhouse, tell me about yourself. I like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain. He smiled. Ah, he has a lighter side. She pulled a ceramic mug from the cupboard and began wrapping it in newspaper. So, you're happier knowing you're actually alive. Part of my somber mood was worry over you. That's still a problem. She gestured to her boxes and took another sip of wine. I'm dealing with my problem. Pack and vanish into the night. She added, once you're put back together again. You make me sound like Humpty Dumpty. If the shoe fits, you both bumped your head. She shrugged and winked at him over her shoulder. Okay, out with it. More about you. Other than that you blush when a woman winks at you. About me? He sighed in feigned irritation. He enjoyed spending time with Heather, even when she teased him. Maybe especially when she teased him. But he could tease back. Is this the school counselor emerging? Could be. But remembering more about who you are might bridge the connection of body to spirit. I grew up right here in Clarksville, so that must be why I was drawn to your car wreck. I played baseball, Clarksville Wildcats. My parents still live here on about 30 acres outside of town. We had horses and pigs and chickens, more of a petting zoo than an actual farm. After high school, I took a year before college to backpack Europe. Really? That must have been fascinating. I wasn't in a hurry for more schooling at a desk, so I opted for cultural enrichment. I kept a list of everywhere I want to go back and visit again. After that, I was 4 years at Tennessee State. As Rave told Heather about his past, his mood stayed light. Talking to her felt therapeutic, and he wondered if students felt this way in her presence. He stopped talking when he noticed Heather had stopped packing. She stared at the box of packed kitchenware. He thought about what she'd said. Pack and leave. And what she hadn't said. Just like last time. Just like all the other moves she'd made in foster care. You don't get attached, do you? Not to places, things, or people. She swallowed. The one time I let myself get attached, the man turned out to be obsessively possessive. I don't want anyone else to be in danger because of me. You're referring to Evelyn? And me?
Anyone. He moved closer to her.
What about your past, Heather? Maybe we should discuss that.
She sealed the filled cardboard box with packing tape and started on another. Oh no, this is your spiritual therapy session and your youth sounds mostly happy. Besides, the more we talk, the more you seem to remember. For me, foster care was not a happy place. Haven't you heard people become therapists in part to learn to handle their own problems? Well, that was part of it. That and hopefully giving kids in troubled families some support they needed.
You miss it.
Denver needs a walk. Denver wagged his tail as Heather fitted his harness.
Blake's still out there somewhere.
Rave frowned his disapproval of her venturing into public. Heather refused to be contained. Yes, but Denver and I need to stretch out legs. Besides, Blake is afraid of dogs. Dogs and heights. I'll be okay on a walk with him. She was out the door and walking at a brisk pace as Rave followed, glancing around in all directions. She smiled to herself, enjoying the fireman's protective nature. Truthfully, she wasn't as cavalierly dismissive of danger as she led on. She was always looking over her shoulder. She'd spent 5 years fearing the day Blake would find her. But she'd promised herself long ago that hiding inside 4 walls wasn't living. She wouldn't give Blake that type of power over her.
That's the Customs House Museum,
Rave commented. Ah, more memories. She looked at the unique building of stone and brick with its steep tiled roof.
I remember the 1999 F3 tornado that ravaged downtown. It's when I knew I wanted to become a fireman and help people. I was here and helped rescue efforts during the 2010 flood and another tornado that hit in 2018.
Wow, I picked a natural disaster haven to live in. It's a beautiful town. I guess getting rebuilt a few times adds character. She kept walking, feeling like she was a counselor again, taking someone for a therapeutic wander down memory lane.
There's a lot of character, a lot of history. Trail of Tears, Civil War, the Lillian Theater, later named the Roxy Theater. It was the backdrop for Sheryl Crow's song All I Want to Do.
And it's a growing city. Every day I feel like I see new construction.
Yeah, it's not small-town America anymore.
It still has that down-home feel, though. Rave looked around.
Yeah, it does.
He stopped and turned toward her.
You're bringing back my memories. I can't thank you enough.
He extended a hand, then seemed to remember she couldn't hold it, and pulled it back. She wanted to hold his hand, too. She felt like doing so would physically confirm the emotional connection she was forming with him. Perhaps it was better she couldn't touch him. With Blake on the prowl, she couldn't be in Clarksville much longer. She didn't need to add heartache to the list of baggage she'd carry with her to her relocation destination. Rave saw her safely back home. He shuffled his feet as she lingered by the door. She'd had dates that had less awkward goodbyes. See you tomorrow? She was reminding him of the hospital trip with Evelyn. He nodded. If it had been a date, she might have told him what a nice time she'd had, or how she was looking forward to seeing him again. Since he was a ghost, and their time was limited, she opted for a simple, "Goodbye, Rave."
Goodbye, Heather.
Chapter 5. The next morning, Rave sat quietly in Heather's kitchen while she dressed and prepared for the day. She wore her usual blue jeans, this time paired with a plush lavender sweater. After an insufficient breakfast of coffee and an orange, she put a harness on Denver that looked different from the one she'd used yesterday. Rave inspected the stitching on Denver's brightly colored harness.
Recreational therapy dog.
Yep. Denver goes with me to the retirement home once a month. Rave scratched his chin.
We're going to a retirement home?
He thought they were going to the hospital. Nope. As promised, Evelyn will take us to the hospital. Denver here is our ticket to your ICU room. They won't let me in because I'm not family, But I might get away with recreational therapy. Most places want you to register with them, paperwork and a prolonged process. I'm just going to walk in and see how far we get. You, Logan Roundhouse, need recreational therapy."
"That's better than lying,"
he said. "Yeah," she chuckled. "It'd be a little awkward if I claimed to be your fiancé no one knew about."
"Why would you do that?"
She clasped a leash onto the dog's harness. "While you were sleeping? You've never seen the Sandra Bullock movie?" He gave her a blank look, which earned him an exasperated shake of her head. "Never mind," she said. Outside, Evelyn honked her horn. Rave rode in the back seat with Denver, as Heather rode beside Evelyn. The women talked about the latest political scandal as Rave tried to pet the German shepherd. His hand went unnoticed through the animal, though once he thought he made an ear flicker. He liked dogs, and always thought of getting one of his own. However, fire station shifts were 12 to 24 hours, not conducive to owning a pet. After Evelyn dropped them off at the medical center, Rave followed Heather into the hospital as she held Denver's leash. She walked to the front desk receptionist. Heather gave the woman a warm smile. "I'm visiting the ICU. Well, I'm tagging along. He's visiting the trauma ICU." She gestured at Denver. The woman looked down and instantly warmed to the animal. "Oh, how wonderful! Can you remind me which floor it's on?" "10th floor. Elevators are down the hall on your left." "Thanks." Heather walked quickly, her thick-soled winter boots making no sound on the patterned linoleum floor. This place is enormous. Rave's mind tried to process the spinning world around him. Initially, he thought he was the ghost of a dead man. Yesterday, he learned he was the spirit of a living man. Today, he was going to see himself in the hospital. But why in the world would his spirit leave his body? Was he near death? He wasn't sure he wanted to see himself on his deathbed. Heather apparently did. She moved with the grace and speed of a panther, boarded the elevator, and pressed the already lit button to the 10th floor 3 more times.
"It's already lit,"
Rave pointed out to her. "I know. I'm nervous." The strangers on the elevator cast skeptical glances at the woman talking to herself. When the doors opened to the 2nd floor, Heather walked to the ICU reception desk. The young man behind the desk had eyes only for the dog.
"Look at the handsome German shepherd. I love it when y'all visit."
"This is Denver, and he has a sweet spot for firemen, so when he heard about Logan Roundhouse, he practically brought his leash to me."
"Oh, that's adorable. It's such a sad story. He's down in room 12. Let me give the nurse a heads up in case they're doing a procedure or bathing."
Heather wriggled her eyebrows and turned to Rave. "Bathing," she mouthed. He felt his cheeks flush before he turned away from her. Heather and Denver waited as Rave paced. A moment later, a gangly man in blue scrubs approached. "The therapy dog. He's adorable. Come on back. This one needs some extra furry lovin'." They followed the nurse, whose badge said Philippe, down the hall and into the ICU room. Philippe leaned on the doorway and ushered Heather and Denver into the room. Rave stared at his body in the bed. "Is he any better?" Heather asked. "Well, sweetie, this is only my first day with him, but the doctors think he's doing well. After his induced medical coma, for the brain swelling, he's showing signs of improvement and recovery is expected. All of his reflexes are strong. As soon as he decides to wake up, he'll be able to get that breathing tube out." "Wake up?" Philippe shrugged. "They're not sure if maybe the medications are taking a long time to wear off. There's nothing on his brain MRI to indicate why he'd be slow to wake. No permanent damage." Rave's heart raced. No permanent damage. Was his life salvageable then? But how? "Okay, thank you. If you need anything, I'll be next door with another patient." When Philippe left, Rave and Heather gaped at Logan. He was attached to wires and cords snaking everywhere. A monitor on one wall displayed his vital signs. Denver approached and wriggled his muzzle into Logan's hand.
"Hey, I can feel a tingling sensation in my hand with him doing that.
Rave rubbed his hand. Logan didn't move. Your torso really is that muscular.
That's your first thought?
Rave chuckled. Well, I thought initially you were a hallucination. Then you were a mystery to solve, and I tried not to think about how I was talking to an attractive man. Ghost. Next, I wondered if maybe I was the one in a coma after my crash, and I was inventing this whole thing, which I guess is still a possibility. So, yeah, rather than dwell on the eerie supernatural bizarreness of all this, I'm taking a moment to appreciate your body. She sat down in a chair beside Logan and rested her hand on top of his, which rested on top of Denver's head. Rave felt the tingling sensation grow stronger in his hand. You don't have any burns, Heather commented.
Our fire retardant gear is pretty effective. Firemen seldom get burned. Usually blunt force trauma gets us, as I'm evidence of.
He walked around to the opposite side of the bed and watched Heather watching him. He hated seeing himself looking fragile, dependent on tubes for breathing and nutrition, but having someone worried at his bedside made him feel cherished in a way he never had been from a woman. Heather stroked his hair. You saved my life, Rave. Even in a slumber, you're saving lives. That's some kind of hero.
Considering I wouldn't have found my way back to my body without you, maybe you're the hero.
She smiled. We saved each other.
Agreed. So, how does this work? How do I get back into my body?
He was eager now that he knew his health was good, and a beautiful woman of flesh and blood awaited on the other side of the supernatural threshold. True love's kiss? She batted her eyes and laughed. I've no idea. Why don't you try to lay down and see if you can merge or stitch back together? He moved toward Logan, but hesitated.
Heather, what about Blake?
You still trying to protect me? She grinned.
Yes.
Well, you can do that better if you're solid, rather than a spirit. She bit her lip, and Rave wondered if she worried the same thing he did.
If I don't remember any of our time together, please, come find me. Introduce yourself. I'd want to get to know you, he said. She nodded, but stared at Denver rather than Rave. With her gaze diverted, he didn't believe she felt committed to seeing him out. No attachments. Rave lay down, trying to align spirit and body. After several moments, nothing happened. He sat up. Now what? True love's kiss? Ha! I'd kiss you, but we only just met. Who are you? A voice spoke from the door. Heather bolted out of her chair and spun toward the door. Rave stood. Mom, Dad. A man and woman stood in the doorway. Heather's mouth went dry. I'm Heather Phillips. She wrung her hands, looking for an exit, and trying to remember what her cover story had been in the first place. She couldn't lie to Rave's parents. I'm a friend, but I'm done visiting. I'll let you two have your time with him. She picked up Denver's leash and tried to ease around the pair of them. We wouldn't push aside a friend of Logan's. His mother walked to the bedside and stroked her son's cheek. How'd you two meet? His father asked. Heather heard the slight desperation in his voice, like he needed some happiness amid the anguish he and his wife had been going through. Heather knew that tone from the parents she'd counseled over the years. She slowed her hasty retreat and lingered by the exit. He's my hero. Saved my life. His mom's face brightened in surprise and delight as she sat by the bed. His father stood beside her. They waited silently for her to continue. I was in a car accident, and Rave saved me. If he hadn't gotten me out of my car, I would have died in the fire. Rave? His mother blinked. Yes, my nickname for Logan. The woman smiled. He always liked ravens. He said they were his spirit animal. Some people think they're an ill omen, but Logan always said they were intelligent birds of insight. Rave watched his parents with a tortured expression. And they connect the material world and the spiritual world. I think his spirit animal is watching out for him.
Heather told his parents. His mother nodded. Perhaps, but I always think of the Edgar Allan Poe poem. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon that is dreaming. She shuddered.
The deep meaning of that poem is that you can't hold on to things that you love forever, or it will consume you. The man in the poem couldn't let go of his lover, and so his soul would be lifted nevermore,
Rave explained to Heather. Heather kept her gaze focused on his mother. I prefer the raven Tirsica Brooks writes about. Her birds are pure of heart and devoid of judgment, like the Rave I know. His mother placed a hand over her heart, and his father put an arm around her shoulder to comfort her. I like that very much, the woman said. Heather had gotten that information from one of her many smartphone searches during her many ride shares.
I like that one too,
Rave said. Rave silently waited with Heather for her ride. Seeing his parents' distress tore at him more than seeing his body lying in bed. Heather had been sweet to give them the hope and encouragement they seemed to need. Evelyn drove Heather back home. The two women talked about the house Evelyn was helping a client close on, and all of the drama revolving around the home inspector's findings. Rave rode with them and stared out the window, the world outside passing him just as it did while Logan slept in the hospital bed. He'd never regret being a fireman. The first fire truck he saw at the age of 6 on a preschool tour had been love at first sight. He'd helped a lot of people over the last decade, and he made a new family with his co-workers. They ate, slept, played cards, lifted weights, trained, and bonded, all under the same roof. Then the building fire call came from dispatch, a 1061. Victor hadn't survived. Rave had, but he'd become somehow disconnected from himself in the process, and he didn't know the remedy for his predicament. To add to the confusion, he'd met a remarkable woman whose life was shrouded in danger. At least he understood their connection now. She lived in his hometown of Clarksville, where he had been wandering when the crash had happened. The incident drew him to help her. If he woke and didn't remember her, he couldn't help her. If he woke, weak from his coma, he might not be able to help her even if he remembered. He wondered if his own reluctance to join his body was the reason the reunion hadn't worked. When they arrived back at Heather's house, Rave didn't follow her inside.
I'm gonna take a walk.
Sure, okay. She let herself and Denver inside and closed the door. Rave heard the beeping of the alarm system, deactivated and reactivated. With Heather safe inside her home, he whisked himself back to his hospital room, where his parents still watched over him. His mother sat beside his bed, where Heather had been, and his father sat in one corner staring out the window. A woman came to visit you today, Logan, and she's a looker. Probably a firecracker with all that red hair. But maybe a firecracker and a fireman are the right combination. Rave shook his head with a smile. It would be just like his mother to see a woman holding her son's hand and jump to conclusions.
She only said she was a friend,
his father pointed out, with an amused tone.
Her eyes said she was more. Besides, he's all work all the time. The last girl he brought home was, what, prom 15 years ago?
His father rolled a pen in his hand, and Rave wondered if he was missing his pipe.
He's had relationships. He's told us about a few of them.
No one he thought well enough of to bring home to meet us.
Honey, meeting a woman in his hospital room doesn't qualify as bringing a woman home.
His father's attempt at levity would have been well accepted under different circumstances. Instead, Rave's mother bristled. She sniffed.
Well, it might be the closest thing we ever get.
Rave felt sorrow well inside him.
Oh, Mom, I'll find a way to come back, I promise. And you can meet Heather. If she agrees, I'll even bring her home for dinner.
His father went over to her chair and wrapped his arms around her.
I'm sorry, honey. I didn't mean to upset you. She seemed like a sweet woman. I bet they've had some happy moments. Maybe Logan was still getting to know her before he brought her home.
His father stood and patted Logan's shoulder.
We're very proud of you, son. You know your mother has that scrapbook of articles of all the people you've helped. It's only half full, so you come on back to us, because your work here isn't done yet."
He reached for a tissue at the bedside and dabbed his eyes. Rave let his own tears fall. Blake popped a couple of oxycodone pills in his mouth and washed them down with soda. His back ached from the long hours doing car surveillance. Now that Heather knew he'd found her, she was probably making plans to bolt again. He couldn't let that happen. He had to keep the tail going so he wouldn't lose her. But she was being erratic. His appearance had altered her routine, probably as she made arrangements to pack up and move. But what arrangements would take her to a cemetery, a firehouse, and a hospital? Was she coming unraveled? Could she have the common courtesy to come unhinged in a way that made tracking her easier rather than harder? All her ride shares buffered her. He didn't want witnesses when he reclaimed what was his. And the odd locations meant he didn't get downtime from his never-ending surveillance. He rolled his neck, feeling each vertebra pop. He followed that with a twist of his back, then cracking of his knuckles. Soon he'd find the opportunity. She'd get careless, and then he'd pounce like a tiger. Chapter 6. Heather threw herself into her writing. She had enough experience with emotional turmoil that she knew how to manage it. After a year of therapy following her divorce from an abusive man, she'd learned how to function even when her life became taxed with unsolved problems. No, challenges. She knew as a counselor that the word challenge possessed a positive connotation over problem. She knew how much to distract herself with writing and when to cut through the anxiety with the endorphins of exercise. She hadn't, however, learned how to trust a man again. The few relationships she'd had since Blake had been fun and physical, but she'd never dispensed her address, phone number, or last name. She maintained no social media accounts. Now the perfect man had floated into her life, literally, honest and honorable, and he'd never lay a hand on her in anger, and not because he couldn't touch anything. The problem, challenge, was that she needed to help him get his life back. She didn't know if that life of tangible solidarity included her or not. The fireman knew her secrets. Those skeletons in the closet were enough to deter any man. If the fear of a vengeful ex didn't make a suitor run, the stigma of a battered woman might. The ill-conceived notion that such a woman was dysfunctional, either from mental health issues or trauma, damaged goods. And maybe Heather was. But she'd never met someone who'd traveled life unscathed. Everyone had scars, and scars were a sign of healing, a sign of strength. Somehow Rave didn't seem put off by her scars. But that didn't mean he'd want a relationship when he woke up. Rave could reconnect with his body and either not remember her or not want to associate with her at all. The uncertainty of the future hovered over her like a black cloud. She was going to need more therapy when all of this subsided. Heather was on her elliptical machine when Rave reappeared. "Knock, knock," he said. She smiled. Suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. Rave chuckled.
"I promise I'm not here to haunt you like Poe's Raven."
"No," she agreed. "I've really enjoyed your company."
"How'd your writing go?"
he asked. 2 articles. How'd your personal time go?"
"Good."
He slipped his hands into his pockets. "Any trouble in the periphery?" she asked.
"No, but it occurred to me that I should see a picture of Blake, so I can commit his image to memory and know who to be on the lookout for."
"I didn't keep any photos, but we'll look online." She wiped a towel across her forehead. "We were married for 6 months. In hindsight, I should have seen the signs. Telltale moments of possessiveness. Hints that he thought I should quit my job when we were married.
or that I shouldn't do as many activities with friends. But I was young, and he seemed so much wiser.
She slowed down her speed to cool down.
I also didn't have any family. I think that made me overeager to create one of my own, and pretend the flaws in him were cracks rather than craters. Whatever the case, the first time he struck me, I vowed would be the last. It wasn't, but I left and filed for divorce. His text and emails became more threatening, all great to use in court, but wreaked havoc on my psyche. I moved from place to place, shelter to shelter. When the papers finalized and I got half his worth, not because I'd earned it, but because I needed to disappear, I cashed out and did just that. Disappeared. Here we are, 5 years later, and he's found me. Time to disappear again. Too bad I don't have enough saved to move to the Caribbean.
Rave didn't smile. He calmly listened, while wearing a concerned scowl.
You said you didn't have a family?
Foster care. I don't know who my parents were. I figured they had no use for me, so I have no use for them, she said.
You've had a rough life.
Heather stepped off the elliptical machine and gulped water from her bottle.
I've got a job I enjoy, a pet who adores me, and a roof over my head. I don't have any use for pity, either from myself or anyone else.
She looked at Rave.
Until today. I felt a twinge of self-pity when I saw your parents beside you in the ICU. So much love. What would it be like to have a family unit like that? When I made the comment about the raven, I was afraid your mom might hug me.
Rave gave a slight smile.
She's been known to do that.
I probably would have cried.
Would that be so bad?
He asked softly. She regarded Rave. She'd bet he was the type of man who'd hold a woman and just let her cry, no questions asked, until she was ready to talk.
No, I guess not.
She left the small room, her home office and gym combo.
I'm going to shower, fix dinner, and then you and I are going to watch a movie.
We are?
Yes, we need distraction and happiness. And since you can't change the channel, it'll be a romantic comedy. While you were sleeping.
He grinned, chocolate eyes sparkling.
I could always disrupt the signal.
Yes. Apparently, your supernatural talents include electrical disturbances and raven summoning. Anything else?
I think I can sense danger. At least when you're in danger.
Useful. I'll be back.
She closed her bedroom door. Rave sat on the couch beside Heather while she flipped through on-demand platforms to find the movie she wanted. They'd talked through dinner about where each of them had grown up. She'd touched on some of her foster home days. The conversation had seemed to flow effortlessly.
So, what do you do for fun when you aren't rushing into fires and saving lives?
Rescue cats out of trees?
He joked.
No, honestly, I like playing the guitar. Sort of a holdover from high school and college band days. You also can't grow up near Nashville and not have music be a part of your life. I like playing and watching most athletic games. Basketball, baseball, soccer. What about you?
I like listening to music, though I have no inherent talent myself. But I would enjoy listening to you play. I liked biking, before I became a recluse. Nothing cleared my mind like 20 miles of open road.
Rave pulled his gaze to the television as he tried not to envision Heather in tight bike shorts, leaning forward, muscles flexing as she pedaled.
As for watching sports, she continued, I like anything non-contact. Tennis, ice skating, golf. I can do baseball, too.
Golf?
He turned back to look at her.
There's something very soothing when the announcers talk quietly as the athletes take their shots. It's therapeutic.
Maybe I should start watching golf. When I get my body back, or when my body gets my spirit back, we should go to a baseball game. Go see Nashville Sound play.
I'd like that.
Can't bike there, though, so we'll have to do a separate bike trip. And, he added, since you live near Nashville, There are 100 great places to go listen to music.
Heather smiled at his planning future dates with her, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. She was a guarded woman, like she wanted to share his optimism, but couldn't help but worrying about the future. Even if he did wake up, and if he remembered her, he wondered if she'd stay in Tennessee to be with him. No, she wouldn't risk putting Rave in danger. Well, he needed to convince her he was willing to take that risk. Rave rested his hand on top of Heather's. He wanted to know what she felt like, wanted to feel her warm skin and smell her scent. Maybe strawberries with all that flaming red hair. His hand sunk into hers, but the sensation was different than the other matter he passed through. Her essence had a faint, tingling warmth. When he looked into her eyes, he tried to read her expression. Part surprise, part something else.
What does it feel like?
He asked. Like champagne bubbling lightly on my skin? He grinned. She licked her lips as her cheeks flushed. Movie? She asked dryly.
Movie.
They lapsed into comfortable silence during the movie. Toward the end, Heather fell asleep on the sofa with Denver on the floor nearby. Rave wished he could pull a throw blanket over her. He watched her sleep as he wondered what a kiss with those sweet pink lips would feel like. He heard beeping and for a moment smelled sterile plastic. He had the sensation of lying on his back, fluorescent lights overhead. Was this his time to reconnect? Back to his body? Or was he being summoned to the light? He wanted to say goodbye to Heather, but if he could get back into his body and wake up, he'd never have to say goodbye. Unless he didn't remember any of this when he woke. But she'd come introduce herself, right? Heather woke to Denver's cold nose. She patted him gently on his head, rolled off the sofa, and let him into the backyard. Rave? No answer. She recalled he'd said time was harder to keep track of as a ghost. He'd show up eventually, and when he did, she'd share her next plan to help Rave repair the connection to his body. As she dressed, blue jeans and a cream-colored sweater that accentuated her auburn hair, she contemplated her new life. Maybe a quiet coastal town in Maine? She'd miss Evelyn, but she had Denver. At least she'd designed her job to be mobile. Heather caught another rideshare, a 40-minute ride back to Nashville. She needed a new car, but there was no point buying a new one until she moved. Maybe that was how Blake had found her. She'd finagled her driver's license under a different address, but she couldn't do anything about the state. Perhaps at her next location, she'd forego getting a license altogether. Move to a place she could bike everywhere she needed to go. She exited the car, tipped the driver on her phone app, and stood outside the chain-link fence that surrounded the industrial building, what was left of it. The metal frame structure still looked 2/3 intact, but most of the walls had been incinerated. Staring at the monstrosity of charred and twisted metal, she wondered how Rave had managed to survive a cave-in. She imagined the appearance of the fully involved structure with flames rising high into the sky and black smoke billowing like an angry storm. Then Rave and his team arrived, black gear with reflective stripes glowing by the light. They hoisted yellow air tanks onto their backs and bravely entered the hazardous building. Heather looked around, but didn't see Rave. Her plan to try reconnecting him with Logan by returning to his place of injury could only be tested if Rave showed up. She tugged on the lock, loosely connecting the two chain-link fences. Locked. There was a do not enter sign, but Heather didn't want to walk among the wreckage anyway. She only wanted to get Rave here, to see if the place of his injury could help him reconnect with his body. But where was he? Blake saw his opportunity. When Heather's ride drove off, she was alone. She stood outside a chain-link fence that encircled what was left of an incinerated building. Her red hair tossed lightly in the breeze, ridiculous and long. The woman he'd married, the woman who belonged to him, had been a short-haired brunette, conservative, proper. Her current appearance would be one of the many things he'd fix when he got his hands on her. Her back was to the road, so he eased his car closer on the curb. He glanced up and down the street. The closest pedestrians were a few blocks away on either side. If Heather got a scream out before he abducted her, they weren't near enough to help. They also weren't near enough to see his license plate. When Blake put the car in park, Heather was still oblivious to his presence. He smirked. This was going to be easy. Chapter 7. Rave wasn't sure where he was when he sensed Heather was in danger. Somewhere peaceful and cosmic, like floating among the stars. Regardless, he snapped to alertness and pulled his apparition to her location. She stood by a fence, staring at a dilapidated building. He could see the back of her head. Behind her, a man approached in menacing strides.
"Heather, duck!"
Rave screamed. Blake swung a balled fist, intending to punch Heather in the back of her head. When she ducked, his fist landed in the fence. He snarled as he pulled back his bloodied knuckles. Heather turned to see her attacker, and all color drained from her face. She backed away, but the chain-link fence kept her from retreating to safety. Her hands fumbled behind her, as though willing the lock to free itself. As she pushed against the fence, the two halves bowed.
"Between the fences,"
Rave said.
"Can you fit?"
She crouched beneath the padlocked chain and forced one shoulder between the two hinged halves, then her head. Blake's expression turned from anger to surprise as he seemed to realize Heather wasn't trapped. He lunged for her. His hand closed around her ankle as she forced her body sideways through the small gap, tearing her sweater and scraping the skin on her arms. She screamed as she fell back, and Blake yanked on her leg. Rearing her free leg back, she kicked the pole edge of the fence. It sprung forward, striking Blake in his face. He recoiled, grabbing at his bloodied nose. Heather scrambled back on her hands and butt. Her chest rose and fell in gasping breaths as she stared at her attacker.
"On your feet, Phillips,"
Rave commanded, by her side now. Blake couldn't fit through the fence as she had, but it would only take him seconds to climb over it. Heather pushed to her feet and dashed toward the wrecked structure. Rave searched the premises as Blake struggled over the fence. What could he use to stop this madman? There were chunks of concrete debris and loose rebar, none of which Rave could wield. Blake must have formulated a similar plan, because he snatched up a 3-foot-long piece of rebar after he cleared the fence. Rave looked desperately up and down the street. A few gawkers were approaching, probably lured by the sound of Heather's scream. They were pulling out their phones, some calling for help and others taking video. No one was moving to help the woman fleeing for her life. No one could get to her before Blake did. Rave rushed to Heather's side, flying through the air.
"Watch out!"
She spun, but not fast enough. Blake had hurled the rebar at her from a distance, like throwing a javelin. She took the blow to her shoulder and back. It knocked her to the ground, but she rolled and sprang to her feet. Dang, she was tough. She began to climb. Rave looked up, following the path she would take. Eventually, she'd run out of places to go. That was if the building remnants didn't collapse first. He floated up to her. "Blake is afraid of heights," Heather told Rave as she panted from the effort of the climb. "He won't follow me." Beneath her, Blake began the climb. The blood on his face enhanced the rage in his eyes. Rave frowned.
"His desire to harm you seems to have superseded his acrophobia."
When Heather reached the highest she could go, about 5 stories, she stopped to catch her breath. Her hands, covered in soot, dirt, and rust, clung to the beam. Blake continued to climb.
"I'm going to kill you."
When Rave saw the fear and desperation on Heather's face, his anger soared. Heat flooded through him like a backdraft in a building fire. He clenched his fists, furious at his inability to help her. Then he saw a raven perched on one of the beams, and an idea gave him hope.
Heather,
Rave softened his voice and pointed.
Walk to that vertical beam and hold on to it.
In order to walk where he directed her, she'd have to cross a beam only 4 inches wide.
But there's nothing to hold on to while I cross,
she protested.
I know. 1 foot in front of the other. Try to imagine you're just walking on the curb of a sidewalk. It's about that wide. You can do it.
Okay.
With her legs trembling, Heather took slow, shuffling steps. Rave was certain he felt his heart pounding all the way across town in his hospital room. At last, she reached the other side and clung to the pole.
Heh,
Blake cackled.
You've got nowhere to go.
Neither do you,
she snapped.
You shouldn't have left, Heather. You don't break a marriage vow to your husband.
I'm pretty sure cherishing someone doesn't involve punching them,
she hollered back. Blake glanced down at the long drop below before easing himself onto the horizontal beam, holding his arms outstretched for balance.
It does when you don't obey.
You lost, Blake. I'll never obey, and we'll never be together.
Then I guess we're a cliché. Till death do us part.
He was halfway across the beam. Rave called on everything he had to command the ravens who'd been quietly gathering around the building ruins. They swept into the air before diving toward Heather. As they encircled her, they formed an impenetrable barrier between her and Blake. The rational choice, the sane choice, would have been for Blake to back off and leave Heather alone. Instead, Blake advanced, swatting at the flapping black wings as they whirled protectively around Heather. Blake's balance faltered before his footing slipped. Screaming, he lost his balance and fell 5 stories into the concrete shards and rubble below. Rave closed his eyes. Blake's obsession had led to his own demise.
Nevermore.
Rave entered the flurry of the ravens, and his apparition was swept up in their small tornado. His world turned black before bright light struck his eyelids. He blinked his eyes open to the sensation of a painful, stiff body on a firm bed. Heather kept her eyes shut tight as her arms and legs shook. She could hear the birds circling her, protecting her. Although she'd heard Blake's screams fade and then vanish, she didn't dare move. Her fear hadn't yet subsided.
Heather?
Rave's voice was a whisper in her ear, audible over the sound of flapping wings.
You're safe now.
And the air went still and silent. Heather opened her eyes. The ravens flew away, black angels speckling a light blue sky. Rave was gone. She blinked away tears. "Hey, lady, just hang on. The police and fire department are coming." She looked off to one side, where a group of bystanders stood just beyond the chain-link fence. All she could do was hold on. She didn't trust her legs to carry her back across the beam, or down from this height. Moments later, sirens filled the air. Heather eased herself lower, so that she was seated on the horizontal beam, while still clinging to the vertical one.
"Are you hurt?"
a policeman called to her.
No.
Even as she answered, she remembered the beam hitting her shoulder. Nothing ice and ibuprofen couldn't fix.
"Hang on. We're going to get the fire truck as close as we safely can, and get the ladder up to you."
Okay.
That sounded good. She'd sit here and rest, and let the cavalry come to her. The rescue team took time to cut the locked chain on the fence, direct the fire truck around debris, and then raise the ladder. While that was being arranged, the police covered Blake's body and raised a barrier of police tape around the scene. She recognized the firefighter who climbed to meet her.
Just another cat out of a tree?
Joanna gave Heather a puzzled look. Too bad. Rave would have laughed at Heather's joke.
"You're the woman who came by the station,"
Joanna said. Heather looked at the long, extending ladder and fire truck below.
"I guess I get to see the fire truck up close now,"
she joked, even though her voice still quaked. Joanna gave her a warm smile.
"You're going to be just fine. Let's get you out of this tree."
Chapter 8. Heather had her freedom back. After her feet were back on solid ground, she'd endured police interviews. She'd gone back to the beginning to explain everything. Fortunately, the events on the building didn't require much of an explanation. Bystanders had videoed the entire event, her running, then climbing for her life, and finally, the miraculously protective Ravens intervening. With the events in evidence, Blake's death was ruled an accident. Rave had saved her life. When the interview was over, she called Evelyn and updated her on what had happened. Loyal friend that she was, she offered to come over and spend the night. Heather declined. She needed rest, and that ice and ibuprofen. Maybe an Epsom salt bath. Solitude was going to do more for her recovery overnight than keeping company. That night, she fell asleep as soon as her head hit the pillow, an ice pack still against her shoulder. She'd had the briefest time to wonder where Rave had disappeared to. She hoped his disappearance was a reconnection to his body, and not the alternative. Heather woke the following day and busied herself with work and paying bills. She took Denver for a long walk and contemplated buying a new bike. There were so many things she could do with her new freedom. By the afternoon, Rave hadn't returned. She checked news websites, but no one had reported the death of a firefighter. She hoped his absence meant his spirit was back where it belonged. She could go back to the hospital, but she didn't think the recreation therapy card would play again. And if Rave was alive but didn't remember her, well, that would be awkward. Instead, Heather focused on making mental notes of all the public things she could do in the absence of a stalker. She would keep busy. She considered looking into local school counselor jobs, but first, she and Denver would visit the retirement home tomorrow and finally pot those plants with the residents. The day after Rave woke, he was well enough to move out of the ICU. The day after that, he was proving to the physical therapist that a head injury and a week of slumber hadn't slowed him down. He was on a mission. "Look at you," his mother cried with delight as she entered his room. She looked well rested and infinitely less distressed than she had when he'd been unconscious. She set a box of chocolates down on his bedside table.
"Hi, Mom. The doctors say I might be discharged tomorrow."
"Oh, fantastic."
She hugged him. He relaxed into the bliss of human contact. She'd hugged him several times every day since he'd awakened, and he'd enjoyed every one of them.
"Did you find a number?"
he asked hopefully.
"Your friend must be unlisted, dear. I couldn't find a number for Heather Phillips."
Of course, with everything Heather had been through, she'd been unlisted. She had worked hard to stay under the radar, although now she wouldn't have to.
"And I knocked at the address you gave me, but no one answered. She must have been out. Do you want me to try again?"
"No, thanks, Mom. I'll reconnect with her later."
Why hadn't she come to the hospital to check on him? He'd known from the local news that she'd made it safely down from the ledge. Did she not want to see him? Rave, and he'd come to think of himself as Rave even after he'd woken, could speculate that maybe a woman didn't want damaged goods. He was a man who'd suffered a severe head injury, and she might assume he'd have a lasting debility. But Heather wouldn't be deterred by such things. Still, the absence of a visit puzzled him. He needed to get discharged and see her. Heather walked the Clarksville Greenway with Denver. This was the same trail she'd walked him on dozens of times, but it felt different. The springtime leaves seemed brighter, the air crisper. She didn't have to give herself the usual periodic assurances that Denver would alert her to danger and keep her safe. She could walk and relax. Relax. Even Denver sensed her change in demeanor and wasn't as hyper-alert as usual. Denver's ears twitched. He spun, sniffing and wagging his tail. "Denver, what?" Heather turned to see Rave walking down the trail towards her. He wore a gray cotton shirt, black leather jacket, and blue jeans. More importantly, he looked whole, solid, and with a healthy glow. "Rave!" She started toward him, hesitated, and then decided she would toss caution to the wind. He'd gone through the trouble of finding her after waking from his coma. He deserved unrestrained emotional excitement from her. She dropped Denver's leash and ran to Rave. He opened his arms and they embraced. "You're alive and in one piece," she marveled.
"I can say the same about you."
She reveled in the feel and smell of him. "You saved my life."
"I can say the same about you."
She pulled away and looked quizzically up at him. Rave caught her chin in one hand and rested his other hand on her hip.
"You helped me find my way back to my body. If you hadn't dug deeper to discover my identity, I might have been a spirit indefinitely."
She grinned. "Okay, we're a couple of heroes." Denver nudged a cold, wet nose into the conversation. Rave dropped a hand down and pet her dog. 3 heroes, she amended. Denver had saved her years ago through canine love and companionship. Heather stretched to her tiptoes as Rave bent to meet her halfway for a sweet, succulent kiss. She felt both the solidarity of it and the way his touch made her feel light as a raven's feather. When they broke away from the kiss, Heather was both breathless and hungry for more.
"You know what I'd like to do?"
Rave wriggled his body closer. "What's that?" She smiled, enjoying how well they fit together.
"I'd like to pop a bag of popcorn, sit on your couch together, and watch another cheesy romantic comedy with you. I'd even watch while you were sleeping once more."
I think we'll watch Just Like Heaven." Rave bent down and kissed her again. The end.